Hello, hello. Welcome to Wicked Words, the podcast where you get to listen to my terrible New England accent while I talk about true crime and other dark topics. My name is Brooke, and today is episode 4. Buckle up, buttercups, because we have a long one. This case is out of Oregon, and it is actually out of the area that I went to guide dog training at. So this case naturally caught my attention because that area is very, I don't even know how to put it honestly. It's so peaceful and just serene. You just wouldn't expect this to come from there. So I delved into this case and have quite a long story for you. So buckle up. Get ready. And without further ado, let's get to it. Just east of Portland, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, lies a trio of bordering bedroom communities whose humble beginnings were rooted in a pioneer settlement along the final leg of the Oregon Trail. While Gresham may be one of the largest cities in the state now, it started simply with two brothers, Jackson and James Powell, who claimed the land as their own around 1851, calling it Powell's Valley. As more families joined them, the community began to swell, pushing some groups to seek out land of their own elsewhere. Frank and Lydia Revenue arrived in an area a little over 12 miles away. The pair dubbed it Revenue, of course, although it would later be renamed Sandy after the nearby river. They wasted no time building, erecting 2 hotels before the city even became incorporated. After a devastating fire in 1913 that destroyed part of the town, including the 2-room schoolhouse, construction fever only intensified, and the Sandy Union High School was completed later that decade. Between Sandy and Powell's Valley, today known as Gresham, was another small settlement called Boring. Built upon an extinct lava field, it quickly became a leader in the timber and farming industries. Early in the 1900s, the railway that connected Portland to Gresham was extended into Boring, allowing the teenage students to travel exponentially faster to Sandy's newly constructed high school. The establishment served and still serves all 3 territories, welcoming students from all walks of life through its doors. For 4 years, only a few decades ago, it even nurtured the educational needs of 2 individuals that would go on to plan and enact one of the most gruesome murders that this stretch of suburbs has ever seen. Carolyn Keck was a pretty and popular cheerleader who would graduate from SUHS in 1982, the same year as her future partner in crime, Alan Daniel Browning. He, however, was described as pimply and shy, a stark contrast to Carolyn, who probably never really noticed him during the years that they most certainly passed each other in the halls. Immediately after graduation, Keck would go on to marry another alumni of Sandy High, a young man named Bill. William Bill Exum was completing the computer program at Clackamas Community College throughout Carolyn's high school years, but when he was a student at Sandy, he was a varsity football and baseball player, handsome yet humble, and Carolyn fell head over heels in love with him. The day before Bill's 23rd birthday, the two wed, and not even a year later, the pair were expecting their first child. In 1984, Kyle was born. Bill had worked for the Weisdorfer Fur Farm in Boring since high school, but he started at Consolidated Freightways, also known as Conway, the following year, to support his small but growing family. By the time their second son, Jeffrey, was born, he had been promoted to supervisor, and following the birth of Brianna and Trevor, the family of 6 purchased a newly built home on Southeast Tibbetts Court in Gresham. The Exum family was truly the envy of their community. Bill was in management, earning a decent salary that allowed his wife to stay home and take care of their 4 adorable and active children. They were incredibly involved in their church, making them prominent figures around Gresham. Carolyn was even a part-time teacher at the now-defunct Mount Hood Christian Center, where the family worshipped regularly. A staple at the karate studio where her 3 boys practice, Carolyn would run into an oddly familiar face one winter afternoon. Carolyn Browning hadn't changed much since their days in Sandy Union High School, so it didn't take long for the two to recognize each other. Alan and his son had just began taking classes there. He and Carolyn sat together, catching up while the boys were busy with their lesson. After a few weeks of small talk and short spurts, Alan finally got the nerve to ask Carolyn out for lunch, and to his astonishment, she agreed. Even though they were both married, they couldn't deny the unexpected attraction growing between them, and it wasn't long before the other parents at karate were noticing as well, beginning to feel uncomfortable with the little acts of affection that Carolyn and Alan thought they were cleverly hiding. One day, Carolyn pulled into her driveway to find Alan standing there. As she opened her minivan's door, he reached in for a hug. Carolyn quickly pushed him aside, shifting her eyes to check if a neighbor had maybe noticed. It mustn't have frightened her too much, though, since the two would end up making out on her couch, while portraits of the Exum family smiled down upon them. Their lust grew stronger until they could bear it no longer. They escaped the glaring eyes of Gresham to the sleepy village of Newburgh. Following an intimate picnic on a secluded cemetery, Carolyn and Alan consummated their affair for the first time. This only turned Alan's desire into obsession, and just months later, he left his wife and son to pursue his relationship with Carolyn. Carolyn was becoming addicted too. Desperate to see Alan more, she introduced him to her family as a newly divorced parishioner who was in need of extra support. Bill thought Alan was a strange man, but he was always willing to help a fellow Christian. He just couldn't shake this growing suspicion that all the time his wife was beginning to spend with this newcomer wasn't purely innocent. Alan's life would begin to spiral out of control as his infatuation consumed him. Too many absences and long lunch breaks would lead him to lose his job, and eventually he'd be forced to move into the basement of his parents' boring home. Carolyn was the one constant that he could rely on, and using this to her advantage, she would begin to feed into his morbid fascination. In the winter of 1998, the secret couple slipped away to Hood River. In a tiny jewelry shop on the main road, they excitedly picked out wedding rings. Carolyn had already purchased her wedding dress from JCPenney the month before, keeping it with Alan to avoid any chance of its discovery. During this rendezvous, Carolyn tested the waters to determine whether Browning was hooked enough. While Alan was pleading the rest of his life to her, she was hinting at a plan to end Bill's, with questions about cutting brake lines and making arson look accidental. Even though there were no plans made, Alan didn't shudder at the mention of murder, so the seeds were sown, and all Carolyn had to do was water them. By February, Browning was beginning to get restless, badgering Carolyn about the future of their relationship. It had been months since they had planned their nuptials. Now all she had to do was leave Bill. But she couldn't do that, she said. If she left him, she would be broke, and he would certainly get custody of the kids. Carolyn urged Alan to be patient with her. She was working on something, she said. that something being a plan to serve Bill a milkshake laced with crushed up thyroid medication in hopes that it would cause a heart attack. Barely a week later, she reported to Alan that her plan was regrettably unsuccessful. Deciding to add some manure to the subliminal seeds of murder, Carolyn baited Alan by insinuating that Bill was starting to become sexually aggressive toward her, and it was beginning to scare her. At only 140 pounds, Alan was not the athletic, manly man Bill was, though. So his solution to Carolyn's situation was a fish whacker. This suggestion only angered Carolyn, however. She told Browning that he didn't care enough about her to defend her. Confused, he asked her, "What do you want me to do?" Bingo. This was the exact line Carolyn had been waiting for. "Knock him out and set the house on fire. I'll get the kids out, and he'll just die from the smoke inhalation." It didn't take long for Carolyn to propose this scheme. "Just leave him," Alan countered. "You know I can't do that. If he died, though, we would get a fresh start. He has a life insurance policy." Roughly $500,000, she clarified. It was enough for the two of them and their current and future kids to live comfortably for at least a couple of years. Alan was reluctant, but agreed. When he arrived at the Exum house later that night, Carolyn greeted him at the door as she had many times before. But this time, Alan was visibly shaken. He told her he couldn't do it, and he left. Carolyn was pissed. All contact ceased until about a week or so later, a bouquet of mixed wildflowers was delivered with a card that read, "A little bit of sunshine to my best friend, with love." On March 20th, 1999, while Bill was out at a baseball game with the kids, Carolyn invited Alan over. "I know I'm a few days early, but..." She handed him a beautifully wrapped gift box. Alan opened it to find an expensive silver watch inside. "For your birthday," Carolyn said. Carolyn continued on, complaining about a trip to Washington, D.C. that Bill had planned. "He's going to force me to go, and I don't want to, because I know he's going to expect sex," she said. "He can't force you. Please just leave him." Alan begged her for what seemed like the 100th time. Carolyn erupted into her usual tirade of manipulation, accusing him of not loving her. Finally, Alan relented and submitted to her demand. "We can have sex after," Carolyn promised, as if it were a reward for completing this heinous crime. Like previously planned, Alan arrived at nightfall, and Carolyn met him at the door, guiding him to the basement where he would wait. He urged her again to simply leave Bill, but without a word, she handed him the fish whacker he had lent her for protection. The kids were asleep, and Bill was relaxing, watching TV, when his wife suggestively sauntered over to him, curled up on the couch by his side, and proposed the two of them sneak away somewhere quieter for a little excitement. Earlier that day, Carolyn had cut up strips of an old towel to use as restraints. She led her husband down the basement stairs to a wooden chair where she would bound and blindfold him. Emerging from the shadows with the fish whacker trembling in his grip, Alan's eyes met Carolyn's, and he shook his head no. She glared at him and mouthed the words, "Do it." Alan inhaled deeply and swung the metal rod across the back of Bill's head. "Who hit me?" Bill exclaimed as he stood up. The chair still dangled between the towel strips his wife tied. He ripped one hand loose and lifted the covering over his eyes. "Oh, it's you," Bill stated, perplexed, recognizing his attacker. As Browning lifted the weapon again, it flung from his grasp, bouncing off the wall, resting on the floor near Carolyn. She picked it up, holding it tightly in her hands, before returning it to Alan. Bill's face must have melted with the realization that his own wife was complacent. Alan continued to strike Bill 3 or 4 more times. "He has to die," Carolyn shrieked, encouraging Browning to beat Bill over and over. After several more blows, he finally stopped twitching, and a fountain of blood poured from his head. Carolyn handed Alan his glasses, which had come off during the frenzy. He stood frozen in disbelief of what he had just done, and it wasn't over yet. He still had to hit Carolyn, at least once, so she would appear to be a victim. A little after midnight, Browning hurried off to Boring, where he could bury the weapon, and Carolyn prepared for her part, stumbling toward a neighbor's house, begging them to call 911. Gresham police arrived shortly after 1 a.m. and questioned Carolyn. She was getting ready for bed, she told detectives, when she heard Bill yell out in frustration from the office and the garage. She went downstairs to see what was wrong, and found her husband lying on the floor in a pool of blood. That's when Carolyn felt something hit her in the back of the head, and she blacked out. Police attempted to wake the still sleeping children, but they seemed unnaturally tired. EMTs suggested Carolyn visit the hospital for stitches. As she was loaded into the ambulance, police assured her that they would find the culprit. Immediately, red flags jumped out at the detective. No sign of forced entry, and nothing was stolen. Bill was callously bludgeoned to death, while Carolyn had one rather small wound in comparison. Additionally, while they were speaking to her, they noticed the blood on her jeans had already begun to turn brown. Despite those details, they attempted to remain unbiased and open-minded. That is until 2 neighbors came forward that morning. After seeing the crime scene tape in the street full of police cars, they wanted to mention a red and silver pickup truck they had seen parked on the street many nights before. They had watched as a shadow crept over to the Exum house before disappearing inside. Signs were undeniably pointing back towards Carolyn. While there isn't a right way to grieve, the folks of Gresham silently side-eyed Carolyn when only a week after her husband's murder, she strolled into the karate studio looking like an entirely different woman. Her hair was lighter while her makeup was heavier. She had on brand new, more revealing clothes and masterfully manicured nails. This widow was not the conservative, modest mother of 4 they had come to know. She giggled as she showed off listings from a real estate catalog she carried with her, but the other parents shifted away from her in their seats, shocked at her tastelessness. Detectives spotted the same red and silver pickup truck hanging around Carolyn's New Portland apartment. This caused them to seek out a search warrant, allowing them to bug her place. When the warrant was granted, police teamed up with a local cable company, offering 3 months of free service to Carolyn. The plan was to plant listening devices into the cable boxes. However, the noise from the TV drowned out their ability to hear, forcing them back to the drawing board. Opportunity struck, though, when a few days later, Carolyn phoned police to complain she felt, quote, unsafe knowing there was a killer on the loose, unquote. They recommended an officer perform a safety check, and she agreed. Jiggling the front door handle, the officer suggested it be replaced, and even offered to do it for her for free, considering all she had been through. Carolyn probably didn't expect the kind gesture to be a police ploy to gain access to her apartment while she was busy bringing the kids to grief counseling. They hurriedly wired listening devices inside her electric outlets, sitting back and waiting. While their tactic was effective, the information they collected was nothing useful, only more insight into how cold Carolyn actually was, chiding her son for crying for his dead father, and engaging in lots of loud sex with Browning. In the months since Bill's death, Carolyn intermittently contacted investigators to let them know that she and the kids had been brainstorming about who could possibly commit a crime like this. They came up with a guy that Bill had argued with at a paintball arena previously, a homeless man that she had fed outside of an Albertsons store once, and even a group of Gothic kids from her son's school. The clock ticked, and she continued to throw out names, disturbingly giving them the name of a fellow churchgoer she thought was strange. Then Carolyn brought up a name that piqued their interest: Carolyn Browning. But Carolyn wasn't implicating Alan. Instead, she was letting them know that they might find his DNA in the Gresham home, since he was a parishioner that Bill had been counseling in the year preceding his passing. With his name formally introduced, police seized the chance to establish their authority, leaving a business card under the windshield wiper of Browning's truck. They also decided to speak to his ex-wife, Tracy, to learn more about him. This proved to be fruitful. Tracy told investigators that she didn't even know Bill had been murdered until one of the moms at karate brought it up. Right away, she felt in her gut that Alan had something to do with it. She and Dylan had been away on the coast for a spring break trip when it happened, she said. But when they returned, she ran into Alan a couple of times, and he had never mentioned it to her. She thought this was pretty strange. The most significant suggestion Tracy made to police was that if Alan had done it, he used this fish whacker. He carries it in his truck with him, for intimidation, he told me. She relayed to detectives. It was time to put Browning under more pressure. The next day, as Alan walked to his truck, fumbling with his keys, he was greeted by Gresham police detectives. Frozen in his steps, they coaxed him to the sidewalk, asking if he would mind if they took some pictures of his truck. Speechless, Alan shook his head. The pair snapped some quick shots, noting the lack of a certain fish whacker. "See you soon, buddy," one of them shouted as they walked away. Almost immediately, Carolyn was calling. The detectives smiled, aware that they were getting closer to cracking this case. "I was just wondering if I could get Bill's truck keys back," she asked. "There shouldn't be a problem," replied the officer. "So, have you got anything going on?" probed Carolyn. Not wanting to tip her off, he responded with a generic statement before excusing himself. Their trap was set, and now all they had to do was wait. Or at least that was the idea, until they overheard Carolyn complaining to her father on the phone, and he mentioned the phrase that would put their plot in jeopardy. "Don't say another word to them and get yourself a lawyer," was the advice Robert Keck gave his daughter. Thankfully, she didn't listen, but this sage suggestion served as the impetus for the police to take action. On the night of May 3rd, 1999, Alan was walking from his truck to the front door of Carolyn's apartment when he was intercepted by police. Officers knocked, and expecting Browning, Carolyn answered the door in black lingerie. I'm positive those were not the handcuffs she was waiting for that night. They were brought in and placed in separate rooms. During her interview, Carolyn admitted to her affair, but alleged it had only occurred once and happened after Bill's death, after a moment of weakness and desperation. When confronted with the bouquet that Browning had bought her weeks before, she explained it away as a simple thank you for all the assistance her family had given him since his divorce. After repeated denials, she finally announced that she knew Alan had killed her husband, but she remained silent out of fear for her and her children's safety. Taking this admission to Browning, he was stunned. The love of his life betrayed him in a heartbeat. He broke down and remorsefully confessed, telling the cops where they could find the fish whacker. The community was thankful for the hard work of the Gresham police, but this wasn't the end of the road by any stretch of the imagination. Alan and Carolyn faced death penalty, which is most likely why they both took a plea agreement, pleading guilty to only one count of murder. This deal allowed the pair to receive life sentences with the possibility of parole after 25 years. And with the case happening in 1999, the sentence minimum is approaching fast, with an expected release date in 2024. I want to shift out of the script now and discuss some things that, some updates and thoughts on this case. While I was researching, I really struggled to find any information on Carolyn's mother, a name, or anything. And this speaks volumes to me. I feel like the lack of maternal presence, especially for girls, can set them up for a future personality disorder. But don't come for me. I'm not a licensed psychologist or anything. This is just my opinion. I'm not sure what her relationship with her mother is like, but it's something that was significant and jumped out to me. I was able to find that Carolyn was born on February 17th in 1964 in Portland, but I had a really hard time finding much more information about her family. She could have a brother or a sister. I'm not positive. Her father may have been born in South Dakota, but I'm not certain. The same goes for Alan. I was able to determine that he's a month younger than Carolyn, born in Portland as well on March 22nd, 1964. I was able to find that he was married to his ex-wife only 2 months after the divorce from her first husband was finalized. And while it's not fact, I uncovered that according to Tracy, she once found a note that he had wrote to Carolyn that said, "I can live without Tracy and Dylan, but I cannot live without you." Also, the instructor from the karate studio said that he knew the pair were having an affair because Alan would show up on days that he or his son didn't have a class. And when he was in class and Carolyn was there, he would try to flex on like the person he was fighting against, even if it was a 12-year-old boy. I only briefly touched on the red flags that Gresham police picked up on, but some of the other ones included the fact that she was smiling when they approached her. When they first arrived on scene, she wasn't even crying when they told her that Bill was dead. Instead, she asked them for aspirin, and when they gave it to her, she said, "Oh, it's for a sore throat," but then she swallowed the pills without water. That's a sign of a true psychopath. All kidding aside, in 2009, Carolyn participated in a program that gives inmates the opportunity to train future therapy dogs. And no, just in case you're wondering, it's not Guide Dogs for the Blind, which has a campus in Boring, Oregon. It seems like the program might not exist anymore, though, because when I tried to look it up, I kept getting an error message. I was only able to find archived pages of it. In 2017, the Oregon Zoo partnered with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and a nonprofit called the Institute of Applied Ecology in an effort to recover the endangered Taylor's checker spot butterfly. And they did this by teaching the inmates how to care for them. I guess the butterflies only have this very limited time to breed. I think it's like 2 weeks. So they nurture them and they procreate, and that's the end of it. They die. Which I think is a very sad thing to have in prison, but it's for a good cause. I'm not sure if this program's still going on. I did find multiple articles that mentioned it, and it's unknown whether they're referencing the same story from 2017 or if it's a continuing program that is going on today. Only 2 years after participating in that program, she, along with other inmates, put together a walk for suicide, and they were able to raise over $3,000 for charity. And only 2 years ago, in 2020, she became one of only 2 incarcerated women in the nation to receive the title of Distinguished Toastmaster. This is something that I guess her father had held for years as well, so it really interested her when the program came to Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. While Carolyn has been busy, there really isn't much from Browning. He was transferred from Snake River Corrections to Oregon Department of Corrections in Salem after it was found out that Carolyn was romantically involved with an inmate in the same facility as Alan. And this was found out because the two were writing messages back and forth to each other that were graphic and sexual in nature. Now, the shocking thing is the man she was speaking to is a convicted rapist and sex offender in Oregon, and his name is David Kinnar. It's public record. I'm just going to put it out there. I'm not sure if they're still together, but this was something that came up while I was doing my research. I'm going to throw it out there. I mean, she was able to convince Alan to murder her husband. So it's not too far out there to think that she would be able to convince David to do something to Alan if she really wanted to. But again, that's my opinion. Don't come for me. Just a thought. Let's go on. I'm sure you'd rather hear how the kids are doing than how Carolyn and Alan are doing, though. And they are all living their private lives in Oregon. Kyle is 38 years old now, and he's roughly the same age his dad was when he passed away. He's married to a gorgeous woman named Katie, and he's a father to two beautiful little children. Jeffrey is a huge football fan like his dad, and you can even follow him on Twitter. I'm not sure if he lives with Trevor, the youngest son, but while I was doing my research, I found that Trevor had mentioned he bought a house with his brother in 2010, the same year that he graduated, which is an absolute wonderful thing for them. Also, I think it's amazing that Trevor was a baseball player at Sandy Union High School, just like his dad. Brianna, the only girl of the group, was who I was able to find the most information about. She studied at Western Oregon University, getting a bachelor's degree in communications, and she is now a certified behavior professional. She's a wife and a mother, and I also found this really heartbreaking story that she shared, and I wanted to share it with you. It was a story about like her memory of her parents fighting about Alan. And one of the things was that she remembers her mom taking off in her minivan, saying she was going to go get food. And Brianna pedaled after her on her bike as fast as she could to see if she was really going to get food or if she was going to meet Alan to be unfaithful. And my heart breaks for her because that's not a memory that she should have of her parents. And I hope that she's able to make memories with her own children in her father's honor. It is so evident that Bill's children miss him daily, and it isn't hard to see why. Even 20 years after his death, people are still leaving kind words on his online obituary. Bill wasn't a native Oregonian. He was born in Seattle to Glenn and Carolyn Exum, who took custody of the children after his death. He was also brother to Diane and Sherry, who assisted their parents in raising their nibblings. Bill was described as a loving and hands-on dad. The detective who was involved in his case recalled seeing a family circus cartoon clipping among Bill's possessions, and he said it spoke to the kind of man he was, and it really hit home with him. Bill was laid to rest at the Lincoln Memorial Park in Portland. It was alleged that part of the murder plot was to set the house on fire. I couldn't find any information about whether or not a fire was set, but the prosecutors had brought up the theory that the reason the children were so hard to wake that night was because Carolyn had drugged them, and her plan was to set the house on fire and make it look like an accident. They claim that not only did she drug them to keep them from getting out of the house, but to keep them from getting up while Alan was bludgeoning their father to death. The children consider their father a hero for fighting so hard. They feel like it forced their mother and Browning to change their plan, and it possibly saved their own lives. Carolyn hasn't let her children grieve and grow in peace, though. She's continued to appeal and apply for post-conviction relief, blaming everyone for her predicament, going as far to say that she was coerced into confessing because the police threatened to arrest her son Kyle if she didn't. Her latest attempt is a cry for clemency, which has been met with a fierce round of activism from the state of Oregon, and the Exum family included. There's a change.org petition, which I will leave the link to in the description box below if you're interested in signing it and showing support for the family. To sum up my thoughts on Carolyn, I don't feel like she deserves to be released ever. While she's been like a model prisoner, it's not for the benefit of society. It's to alleviate her boredom. It's she's not remorseful. She has never been remorseful at any court appearance she's been in, and she didn't even cry when she was read her sentence, which is something that Browning apparently has different from her. He was extremely sad and apologized to everybody apparently. They're just completely different. Like I in every single way. When you look at them, their personalities, it makes you realize that's probably why their relationship was so toxic. Which is crazy because she really had the balls to say that Bill was controlling and he was abusive, which I think is absolute bullshit. She has grandchildren now, and they deserve to grow up knowing that justice is being upheld for the grandfather that they didn't get the chance to know. Lastly, I want to shout out Michelle Roberts from the Oregonian. She's a phenomenal author. She did a two-piece article on this, and it was so captivating. I was literally searching through the internet to get the second part of it. She did so awesome. So I will link that also in this episode's sources page, which is in the Google Drive link below. As always, thank you for listening. If you have any feedback, you're always welcome to send it my way. You can leave a comment. You can shoot me an email. Always feel free to subscribe and suggest a case if you'd like. The next episode actually is going to be a case suggestion. It's one I've never heard of, but I cannot wait to dive into this. I just briefly scanned some information this afternoon, and I was blown away. Like I can't wait to get further into it and present it to you guys. So stay tuned, and as always, I will catch you on the flip side.